Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Dakota, a YouTube channel that's designed to take a comprehensive look at the various facets of narcissism from different psychoanalytic perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's video, we're going to look at the complexities of dealing with narcissistic relationships, and we're going to distinguish between three types of anger that get expressed. We could call it anger, rage, and hatred. In order to tackle these sort of complexities in the narcissistic relationship, we're going to focus on three pivotal questions that frequently emerge in online discussions around narcissism. The first question is, how do we distinguish between healthy and unhealthy forms, or let's say expressions of anger? The second question is, what gets triggered in the person who engages in counter-controlling measures? In other words, they're in a relationship with a narcissist who's trying to control them, but they engage in counter-control measures. So then you have two people in a relationship seemingly trying to control one another. And the third pivotal question is, how do we make inroads into narcissism? Now, if you've been following my videos, you know that narcissism is very complex and is made up of many different facets. So that question in and of itself is way too big for us to tackle. So what I would suggest is we focus on how do we make inroads into, in order to keep with the theme of this video, narcissistic rage. The recurring theme in the literature on this topic, this is the psychoanalytic literature, suggests that anger sort of exists on a spectrum. So I want to break this down by way of an example, just to make it very easy for us all to understand. So this spectrum could look something like this. Anger. So what is anger? Anger is a natural response to, let's say, a frustrating or an experience of some sort of injustice. So picture this scenario, and here you could fill in the details in terms of whatever is most relevant to you. But let's say you're driving your car and you're getting off the parkway and you're in the exit lane, waiting patiently, and somebody comes and cuts in front of you. Or you're online, at your local grocery store, or at the airport even, and you're waiting for quite some time and somebody cuts in front of you. The response of anger would look like what? You may make a facial expression, you may feel annoyed, you may feel agitated, right? You may have probably some words for this other person, but most likely you're going to contain it because you don't really want to put yourself or the other person in any sort of harm. So let's compare that with rage now. Use the same exact scenarios. You're you're in the exit lane and somebody cuts you off. And you've all heard of this before. This is what's commonly called road rage, right? So now, instead of just beeping the horn, like if you're angry, right? Now you lean on that horn in a more aggressive way. You'll lean out the window. Maybe you'll even pull up next to the driver and you'll start yelling at them, right? Maybe you'll try to cut back in front of them since they cut you off. And the same thing goes if you're online at the airport or at the grocery store. You may accidentally, let's say, bump the other person or confront them. Maybe you have some choice words for them, which aren't very nice, but the point is, the difference between the anger and the rage, as you could see, is you are now taking an action. So you're putting either yourself or somebody else in harm. The behavior is more driven, right? It's more impulsive. It's almost as if you can't hold yourself back. Like you're not going to take that from somebody else. Now, finally, let's talk about hatred. Again, using the same examples that I just described. What you would actually do now, since hatred is more of a prolonged and enduring feeling that we carry around, what you may do is, I was about to say all of the above plus something else, but it's actually not all of the above. It's all of what's included in rage in terms of leaning on that horn, driving aggressively, cutting the other person back off. But maybe now what you'll do is you'll take note of their license plate number. Perhaps you have a friend who's, in the local police department, or you want to do some research on this license plate number and look them up. Because maybe you'll actually go and do what? Key their car or something along those lines. Because the main point with hatred is the long-lasting impact that it has on you. It's enduring. and you need to get revenge for some sort of injustice. So you need to retaliate and get revenge. And the same thing if you're online and maybe you still have a little bit of judgment. Usually you don't, but let's say you don't confront the person directly, or even if you do and you confront that person online and you're verbally assaultive towards them, you won't let it go there. You may follow them out to their car, and then again the same thing, get their license plate number. Maybe you'll follow them home, and with the plan maybe to do something later on in terms of sabotaging something at their home. So that's the difference right there. So anger, there's more space, in other words, to think things through. Maybe to even talk about that, come up with some sort of compromise, negotiate a situation. Whereas with rage, it's more impulsive, it's more driven, there's a collapse of space, there's an incapacity to think, to engage your mind, right? And hatred is all of what's in rage, but much more long-lasting and prolonged. So now that we have the basics down, let's look at this in terms of a clinical example, okay? As always, my clinical examples are authentic experiences, either pulled from my online research or my private practice. But as you all know, in order to protect the anonymity of the individuals who are involved, I like to use a composite case. In other words, this is no one individual, but to give you a full immersive experience, I like to combine several different stories. But keep in mind, the stories are real, as are the techniques that are involved, okay? And the techniques and tools are always very important, because on the back of my mind, in my mind, I'm always thinking, and I hope you are as well, is, okay, all this information is really helpful in terms of distinguishing between the three, expressions of anger. But what do we do with this? So picture this scenario. A fellow opens up his credit card and he takes a look and he sees that there's an unusual large amount of money that's charged. So he feels annoyed, frustrated, somewhat betrayed, and he goes to his partner and he confronts her. He begins to ask her, what's this charge? What is this all about? She feels like she is being interrogated. So what she begins to do is she shuts down. But as she shuts down, he becomes louder and louder. He's yelling at her, he's screaming, he's insulting her, that you have a spending problem, you're addicted. He pounds on the table. He may pound on the table. He may, basically, again, you could fill in this scenario, but the whole situation begins to escalate where she wants to get out of the room. And then he blocks the door because he doesn't want her to leave. Maybe he puts her hands on her. Maybe he shoves her. But you could see how this whole thing escalates very quickly. The main question we want to answer, is this anger? Is this rage? Or is this a form of hatred? In order to answer that question, we need to dive a little bit deeper into this scenario. If there was an intent to physically harm her, then we could say this is an extreme form of hatred. And again, you hear these examples with road rage, where there'll be some sort of confrontation on the road, and somebody will get out with a bat and actually beat the other person. This, in my field, is what we call murderous rage, and this could even be a form of hatred. Even though you can argue with me, well, how do you know it's hatred? It's not prolonged, it's not sustained, right? It's not enduring, but there's an animosity towards the world with anybody who gets out of the car and beats somebody almost to death with a baseball bat. So this is murderous hatred or rage. And we could see it's not at that level, but are we yet able to rule out hatred in this situation? It does get quite violent, right? With him putting his hands on her and threatening her verbally and kind of physically. So what we need to ask now, and by the way, this is really important because we're asking these questions again, because we always have our mind on what is the intervention? How do we intervene? If it's an immediate sort of trigger, most likely that has more to do with rage. Remember, because hatred is something that's prolonged, we just sort of harbor these feelings and we carry them around. So in this case, we'd have to ask, how often does this happen? How often does it escalate to this point? How quickly do they repair the damage? In other words, do they make up? Do they calm down? Are they able to talk about this? Or does this go on and on and on? Also, one other thing to keep in mind, if it is unusual, who knows what may have happened? Maybe this couple just got back from vacation and they had a long, tiring flight with a plane that was delayed. And in that way, when you're tired, you're always more vulnerable, more susceptible, right? This is what we call in my field, again, like regressing. You're in a more regressive mode and you're more easily triggered. But these are the kind of questions we want to begin to ask and wonder about so that we know how and where to intervene. So as we're exploring these various questions, let's break this down a little bit further. First, the guy looks at the credit card and he gets triggered, right? And he gets angry. This is a natural response. We all get angry. And this actually could turn into a healthy form of communication, which he says he attempts to do. But remember what I said is that he felt betrayed. So he feels betrayed. He tries to talk to her. And we could see how quickly it escalates because the space shuts down. In other words, there's no room for thought. There's no room for discussion. His yelling and screaming and devaluing her and maybe banging his hand on the table, these are all forms of intense aggression. So now we have him acting aggressively. And then, as I mentioned, she shuts down. And when she shuts down, he escalates. Now, in order to label this as being hatred, we have to see, like I mentioned before, do they hold a grudge? And how long is a grudge held? Now, you may know about this in a relationship. Like, for instance, somebody does something wrong. And, 1 month, 6 months, maybe a year later, this gets pushed back in their face. That's holding a grudge. That's an inability to let something go. And you sort of harbor a deep sense of resentment towards the other person, towards society. Like in that example of someone who pulls out a bat. I just want to sort of point out one nuance of the grudge, which is it may seem like they're able to let this incident go, but is there a pervasive pattern of this? In other words, do they move from one situation to the next where there's a lot of resentment? If that's the case, then we're saying this may be more about one or both partners harboring some sort of deep resentment and hatred towards the other person. So that's the main point that I want to emphasize, is that if there's this explosive behavior, because remember, we're answering question number 1. We're distinguishing between anger, rage. In my field, this is what we call narcissistic rage and hatred. So in order for this to be hatred, and this is the main point that I'm trying to, is we have to see an enduring pattern of really harmful behavior, right? Like the constant devaluing, belittling, emotional abuse, and physical abuse. If any of these things are in your relationship or in a relationship with somebody that you know, you could feel pretty safe to say that this type of relationship is infused with hatred. This goes a little bit beyond reacting to an immediate situation. Again, what we frequently call narcissistic rage. And it's also important to note that in healthy relationships, individuals do get into argument, but typically there's more space and they're able to talk about these things and come to some sort of compromise. Like, for instance, these charges on the credit card bill, if there was a discussion, maybe he would have discovered that, that they did talk about this. This was for some, home improvement project or things that they needed around the home, right? But he never got that far. Maybe they have a child and this was an unexpected event, an expense for the child or a pet perhaps. But again, they never get that far. But in healthy relationships, again, distinguishing between healthy anger and expressions of this stuff is discussed and it's worked out. Anyway, look, I want to begin to wrap this up, but I'll just say one more thing. In my online social media research, what I typically see is that the narcissist will get in relationships because they want to control you, they want to abuse you, they want to devalue you, and in essence, they want to annihilate. And I want to emphasize one thing, and that's why it's important to distinguish between these, on this spectrum, these different forms of anger, right? Because it is true of some narcissists. I've done other videos on different types or clusters of narcissism. It is true that some narcissists, the malignant narcissist, does engage in these behaviors of just total annihilation, control, devaluing, etc. And by the way, this is a pretty extreme form of also what we call sociopathy, like a psychopath, or a sociopath, I should say. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because Not all narcissists function at this level, which leads us right into questions number 2 and 3, which I'm going to take up in the next video, which is, what triggers them? And these two questions go hand in hand. What triggers someone to engage in this sort of counter-control, and how do we make inroads into this type of narcissistic rage? If you want to learn more about that, please stay tuned for the next video on those two questions. But until next time, typically I like to say, engage your mind, which means keep thinking, right? But in lieu of this conversation, I think what I'll sign off by saying to you, engage your mind, but not your weapon. In other words, leave some space for communication rather than narcissistic rage, rather than that type of reaction. Okay, until next time, bye for now.